Recording. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Keto Pilak. I also work for Keep Growing Detroit. I coordinate our education programming. I also coordinate our beekeeping class. And since COVID, I've also been part-time farmer and worn a few other hats just to try and keep the ball rolling with all of the things that we do to support gardeners in the city. So welcome. We are going to jump into the presentation in a second here, but before we do, I just want to say, as we go along, if you have questions, please put your questions in the chat. The chat is, most folks are familiar by now, but if you're not familiar, chat's down at the bottom, in the middle, should be on your screen. And if you're on a phone, you might have to swipe right or left to try and find where the chat's at. Hopefully we'll also have some time at the end that we can open it up for you to ask questions in person and to open up, a little bit more of a conversation. I guess without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get into the presentation. Okay, so tonight's topic is, we conveniently call this class Water-Wise, water conservation, rainwater catchment, and irrigation system. So kind of everything, all the kind of different moving parts of what methodologies we can use to keep our garden watered, not too much, not too little, just right. And using, in being conservative with the resources that we're working with. There we go. So we'll start out with just speaking generally about what crops need to grow with water. Generally, when we're starting seeds need to be consistently, kept consistently moist until they germinate. But after they're germinated, we can let them, we never want to have a situation after the seeds have gotten that, they soaked up that water and they popped out that cotyledon and they started to grow. We don't want to have a situation where we're watering the plants so much that they're always in water, because essential thing for plant growth is air in the root zone. The roots of the plant need an air exchange as well. And if the soil is saturated with water, we're eliminating that, and that's basically a vector for let's go back, a vector for rot or potential plant problems. So we're trying to find this balance of watering just right. The general recommendation is 1 inch of water per week, but it's kind of a vague definition. Like, how do you measure 1 inch of water? I like to think of it more in terms of one thorough watering one time a week, and that does require some getting used to and getting to know your soil and getting out there and putting your finger in the dirt and to see how much the water is actually penetrated into the soil. You can also measure if you want to have fun with it and get scientific. There's rain gauges out in the world that are pretty inexpensive that you can put out and measure the rainfall for on a day like this and see how much water penetration we actually got. There's also like little DIY kits that you can, I'm sure there's some YouTube videos. I didn't look that up, but I'm sure there's a little YouTube video on how to make your own rain gauge. If plants have too much water, like I had mentioned about there's not enough air, that pushes out the air out of the soil, and that's a probability for rot. It also causes the plants to just not send their roots deep into the soil. They send it, like if you're watering super regularly, plants will be like, well, the water's right there. I'm not going to stretch out my roots. And we really are trying to encourage plants to, stretch their roots deeper into the soil, because then in drier times, they'll have tap roots or roots that are able to access the reserve of water that's below the top, the top tier of the soil. So typically when the soil is drying out, the top layers dry out first, and then below, if you dig down, you'll see that the soil is still moist. I mean, most of the time when we're planting seeds, we're planting in the top few inches. So that's why we have to keep that watered for the beginning of the plant's life. But as they mature, we're trying to, encourage them to grow their roots out. And, in some cases, we'll even, leave them for a longer period between, for a particular crops. We'll let them stay dry for a little bit longer so they'll start to seek out that water and have a deeper root system. If we don't water enough, then the plants will tend to kind of go into, they'll tend to be stunted. The water is a huge part of what allows the plants to grow. They access the nutrients, for green growth, they access the nitrogen and so on. And so they need the water as the vehicle to facilitate growth. And so if it's really shallow, or very little water, plants will tend to look, they may even, they may look, they may look like they're lacking nutrition. They may look yellow or a little bit purple. And that's because the water is, a big piece of them accessing nutrients. Water is also, causes of low water can also be apparent when you see blossom end rot on things like tomatoes, and other plants related to tomatoes like peppers and eggplants and things, because of the direct problem is because of a lack of calcium, but it's directly related to the access to water. So we got to strike that balance, and essentially we're trying to get at this balance of watering it thoroughly once a week, letting it dry out a bit, and then watering it again. As a general rule, leafing crops can really take a lot of water. They love, lots and lots of water, and as long as they get a little bit of dryness between, and that'll help support nourishing young growth. So you can play games with starting out with that 1 inch a week and maybe trying a little bit more if they seem like they need it. And that general rule, I would say, is just that, a rule, not a law. It's something where you have to, get out in the garden and look at the plants. Do they look limp? We've been getting the Garden Resource Program transplants ready this week, and our awesome partners, Earthworks, has been growing out about half of the cold crops. We brought them over to the farm this week, and we've been keeping them outside the greenhouse, which at Earthworks, they were inside the greenhouse. So a lot more wind and sun has been hitting them. And I was out there, I had to water them 4 times yesterday, because every time I went out there, you could see they started to get a little limp. So, when you see that, when you see those kind of indicators, it's definitely a cause for watering.
Hey, Keto, there was one question in the chat.
Yeah.
From Tish. She was saying, how deep should your raised beds, should the soil be in your raised beds? You have any thoughts on that one? I know our boards are usually 10-inch.
Right. I mean, I think most crops need at least 6 inches of soil. It depends on the crop. So like root crops like carrots, you want to have a deeper soil. You want to have 8 or 10 inches, because you want a carrot that gets 8 to 10 inches long. But some of the crops are more shallow rooted, like lettuces and some of the herbs and things, and they can tolerate a shallower bed. But I would say as a general rule, at least 8 inches, and 10 inches is probably even better. Just to allow for that root growth in particular. And on some level, if you don't have, it relates to the watering conversation. It's like, it's a situation where they're going to dry out faster. The volume of soil that's in those beds is going to help retain the moisture, especially if you have like a 50-50 we recommend 50% compost, 50% topsoil, and the compost in that mix is good at holding on to the water. But in containers and raised beds, the soil will dry out quicker. I mean, we definitely see that at the Keep Growing Detroit farm. Again, I was on watering duty yesterday, so I was checking on things, and all the field stuff was fine. We planted out one of our fields with a bunch of root crops and stuff, and I only had to water that once. But the raised beds, I had to water twice yesterday, because of that, because of the volume, and they just tend to, there's really good drainage and they just tend to dry out quicker. So what, in terms of what time of day or, strategies for watering, in terms of timing, if at all possible, the best time of day is to water first thing in the morning. And particularly that's important during the really hot part of the season. And that's because, if you're watering in the middle of the day, the water transpires so quickly that the plants don't even have a chance to take it up before they start. The soil is dark when it being wet, and the sun just absorbs into that soil and causes it to evaporate off, pretty quickly. So watering first thing in the morning gives, before the heat of the day has really settled into the plants, gives them an opportunity to really soak up that water before it gets too hot. It's also a strategy for plants that ideally don't get their leaves too wet, like things that are prone to powdery mildew, for instance, like anything related to cucumbers, melons, and squashes and things of that sort, are prone to powdery mildew, which is a fungus as a result of moisture. And so if you water first thing in the day, then the water will transpire off, once it starts to warm up. Whereas alternatively, if you watered later in the day, and then there would be cool, dark, and damp, and it's a perfect environment for fungus to thrive. That being said, if you work, whatever your schedule down, is set in such a way that watering in the morning is not going to work for you, or your garden isn't where you live, and you can only get to the garden in the evening, that shouldn't deter you. I don't want, like, I'm trying to give you kind of the why and the how, and you have to figure out what works for you. It's not going to be, there's no perfect situation. In some cases, like 7 o'clock is the time I have to water, and you should water at 7 o'clock then. It's what's more important to get water in the ground than, and powdery mildew, as the example I was giving, it doesn't apply to all crops. And there's ways to strategize around that. You could, through some of the systems I'm going to show you, we could try and not get water on the leaves by watering right at the roots, through drip irrigation, or through using a water wand, or one of these kind of treatments.
You had a question about mulching in there. I'm assuming you're going to get to some mulching.
Yes. And you can see at the bottom of my slide, it says, if you, that's just open for you guys, if you want to open, that's open to interpretation. So in terms of tools for watering, there are a bunch of ways that we can water. And I'm going to try and break these down. This is kind of a summary. So for watering from a house spigot, so essentially these are really great options. Most of these require decent water pressure, except in the water can, of course. So, and we're going to get into rain barrels and rain catchment systems a little bit later in the presentation, and we can talk about you know, what applications work for those, but, you know, essentially rain barrels and water collection tanks, rainwater collection, you know, systems require um, either to be set up with a pump of some sort or the ability to function on low pressure. And I'll get into that a little bit more detail down the road. But getting, you know, back to the top here, you can connect, you know, there's a bunch of ways to connect hoses. Um, so, you know, I'll start to like summarize these here. Okay. So the classic watering can, this is a watering can right here that I really like, um, uh, particularly because of um, the the shower head on the end of it. You can't see it necessarily see it up close, but the idea here, and this is kind of important to just adjust generally, is like this is really great function of with the shower head of for watering seeds in particular. So when you're watering, like if you just planted seeds in your garden, you don't want to water with an open hose, or ideally you probably don't even water, you know, there's that you can just put your thumb over the end of the hose and kind of do a spray. It works, but you don't essentially you just, you know, we're intentional about, especially if it's a shallow, it's a small seed, so you planted it kind of shallow, it's close to the surface. You don't want to blast it and push it this way or that. You want a gentle shower of rain or water um, to go onto those seeds to soak into the soil. And so, you know, we're looking for how to make that effect with a watering can or any one of these tools that we're using. I really like this one because of the way you can hold it with one hand and just like kind of tilt it without too much effort, and it sprays a nice shower onto the garden. Um, I think these are $25. I'm sure there's other, you know, similar styles, and you can find them, you know, check out different garden centers for different types of watering cans. I think most importantly is that it has some kind of shower head on the end of it. You could even, you know, yeah, I started to think you could even makeshift one, but um, you know, on a small scale, if like you were doing transplants indoors, you could do like take a water bottle or a uh, or a 2 liter or something and drill holes into the cap, and that works out really well for on a small scale. But when you're out in the garden, you could play around with that with maybe trying to rig up a bunch of holes in the top of a like a milk jug, for instance. Might work, but it would just take a little bit longer. Here's another kind of common watering option, the oscillating sprinkler. Um, so this is a very convenient way to water a garden, but it's very non-specific. So, you know, you can see it's on a lawn here. You know, I think these were designed more for lawn applications because it's intended to kind of cover a large area. And, you know, there are ways you can see those little orange tabs toward closer to the hose at the top. You can adjust those to to adjust the spectrum, if whether you want the spray to go this far or this far out into the garden. Um, I think these are generally an okay option, but if conserving water is an interest of yours, and you know, saving water and being really specific, it's not great for the garden, unless you have a relatively big garden. You know, in my case, in my home garden, um, I use this one sometimes when I just don't have time. It's very convenient because you can just put it in the middle and it kind of covers a lot of area, but it's a generalist. It doesn't work great if you have things that once the garden is more mature and things are taller and shorter, because it's like it's just kind of coming down like rain. And if there's a dry spot under a bunch of leaves, it's not really great at getting down to the base of those. Um, because essentially when we're watering, you know, as our garden matures, the most important thing, you know, to state the obvious, the most important thing is to water the soil. In some cases, it doesn't always work out great that way. It doesn't, the water will be blocked by this or that, especially with these non-specific sprinklers like the oscillator. It's like, it's hitting something and that you look around the garden and you see a dry spot. And so it has, pros and cons. I think, having this in your arsenal of watering implements is not a bad thing. This is an impact sprinkler. These are those one, and so they have this long arc. They like shoot out this, every time that you hear that, there's like this long arc of water, and so they'll tend to be far and kind of wide, but like again, it's not so specific. These are better served for something like a lawn. In some situations you can really dial down one of the little knobs on the side to make the spray more compact. But it's, again, another one that's not very efficient with watering. So I would say of any of the ones that we're talking about today, this is probably the lowest on the least, the one I would least recommend to have around. I started to think that maybe I changed my mind on that, but after playing with it, for a number of years, it just never seems to do what I want it to do. This is what we call a wobbler. Now we're getting into things that are slightly more specific to like agricultural uses. A lot of farms use these. These are really nice because they have a more compact footprint of what they spray onto. And so it basically, there's a spray that shoots up the center and it hits this little thing that's kind of crooked on the top there, and which causes it to spin, and then it just keeps spinning and it spits the water out in a circular pattern. And for a garden that's 20 or 30 feet wide, or even less, you can just dial down the pressure. You can get a really nice consistent watering spray pattern. And so I would highly recommend these. These are a really good option. And another kind of cool thing about them is you can just order the head if you want and get PVC. And so you can make your own stands. So you could make them taller or shorter based on your needs and the crops that you're trying to grow or how you're trying to use it in your specific situation. So wobblers are a plus. There's a cousin to the wobbler that I didn't put in the slides. That's like a sprayer. It does a similar thing, but it's got a more consistent spray pattern. If you want to check that out, take a look at the Farmer's Friend website. I would be sure, T, if you would just put Farmer's Friend in the chat, please. And then here is probably the best option for hand watering is the watering wand. So you can see up in the right here, this has got, these have what we call a breaker on it. So that breaks the water stream up into very much like a shower, like a rain shower. So it's very gentle, but it can do a decent amount of volume at once, not like a fine mist. And because it's on a wand, you can water specifically right at the base of the plant and move it around. So, this requires time and energy. It's not a set it and forget it thing. It's something where you have to go out and water specific things. But, especially as the spring begins and you're just, our gardens start out with, we're just starting this part of the garden right now, and the garden's going to be this whole big area. Well, if you only need to water a 4x8 bed to start, say, then this is kind of a nice option that you can do a 1, 2, 3. And I also want to just highlight, oops, go back. Hold on, let me move. It's kind of hard to see at the edge of these, but there's a shut off on in this lower left-hand corner. I'll be sure to add a slide of this next time, but having a shut off for these is really nice. It's like a little quarter turn. So you can turn the hose on at the source, and then you can, when you get to where you're going to water, you turn on the shut off. And having that is a really, really helpful thing as well, especially for hand water.
Question from Christiana. She said, using these methods, would this be what you use for like a thorough water once a week? I think she was talking about those wobblers.
Yeah, any one of these would be,
Mhm.
could be used in that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're really, and I guess to just go down the thought of that thorough watering one a little bit more. There can be, I'm not sure if I was going to touch on this later, but I'll just talk about it now anyways. There are times in the year when the soil, especially when we have really warm weather, then the soil will dry out relatively quickly, and we'll go out and we'll water and we'll think that we watered really well. And then, but if we dig down, just scratch at the soil, the water only penetrated a half inch or an inch. It kind of it went down and sideways. And so you want to water and really get that saturation to get deep to, you want to water and maybe do a couple tests to see that you actually got good penetration down to 3, 4, 5 inches. A few other options are these different types of garden sprayers. These are pretty common. Most big box stores have them, and hardware stores. These are decent options. I would not as good as the water wand, because you're not, you don't have the extension of the wand to get right at the base, but they still do a good job. Just be sure and when you're using them, to adjust them so you're not blasting the soil like I was talking about earlier, trying to have a gentle mist onto the plants. So now we're getting into some options for watering right in the root zone. So this first one is soaker hose. So basically, this is usually made out of recycled tires, and it's a hose that basically a hose that leaks on purpose. And there's holes, it's basically like perforated, so it leaks all along the hose. So there's a cap on the end of the line. You lay it out in your bed, close to the crops that you're growing, and it slowly saturates the entire area. This soaker hoses have a cousin that's slightly more refined, called drip irrigation. We'll talk about that in a second. Soaker hoses are really readily available, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about it today, because you can get it at most hardware stores. But they don't, they water, if, when you lay it down, the hose might be kind of inconsistent in the soil, or how it's laying, and that affects how much water comes out at certain points in the hose, because it's, because it's not engineered in any specific way. It's just like, water will congregate more in lower areas, and it won't water as much. There's not much pressure in that hose to kind of be consistent over an area, and we like to have consistency, because we want all of the things that we're watering in a particular area to be watered the same, so we know, I tested this area and that area is adequately watered, but over there looks like it's dry, looks like it's watered enough, but as I touch it, no, it's not watered enough. And we might be playing games with this a little bit, with the soaker hose, but I still think it's a very great, very good option.
So so question, would you bury those? Was that, or just laying it on top?
Laying it on top. I think there is options, I think I have seen where people play around with burying that. I don't, like with any of these drip irrigation or soaker hose systems, I wouldn't recommend that because you just, you know, you got to dig it out at the end of the season, or if you're going to plant something, if it's buried, you don't know where it's at. And so you're like, you nick the line and then you got to patch the line because you busted it, and they do just fine. You may want to use some kind of staple, like, there's like a 6-inch landscape staple, looks like a upside down U, um, to hold it in place specifically where you want it.
Yeah. And then before that, before you go on to the drip irrigation, Tish said, do you really need to water perennial plants?
Uh, yes. Do you have to water perennial plants as much as your annual vegetables? No, not as much, but they still need water. I mean, um, you know, it depends on the time of year and how established they are. I mean, um, we're going to talk about how much rain we get in our area, and get into like how much, kind of calculating and stuff and thinking about what Mother Nature helps us out with a little bit more later on in the presentation. But um, it depends on the perennial that you're talking about. If you're talking about edible perennials like berries and asparagus and things of that sort, they're still going to need consistent water on some level. Not as much. I mean, maybe, I don't know, I would say maybe half as much as your vegetables. I mean, vegetables they're young, and they especially when they're starting out, they don't have much of a root system and all that. And perennials, would have a developed root system and tap roots that are going deeper into the ground, so they have more access to the water table and all that kind of stuff. But don't neglect, it's kind of, you can't neglect your perennials or they're going to be unhappy. And it's really specific to what perennial it is. Some perennials can take a beating, and like especially things like rain garden plants, where they're designed to handle really wet conditions and really, really dry conditions. And there are some plants that, I have some perennial flowers and things that I don't think much about all year long, and they do just fine. So it's, I guess, specifically to say you learn specifically about what plant you're talking about and their watering needs. So this is an illustration of kind of the basics of a drip irrigation system, and it varies from the soaker hose in that the drip lines, which is in this lower left hand corner, this picture here, and this is kind of gives another illustration of that. There are specific holes it depends on you can get different sizes and different hole distances, but in this case, every 12 inches or so, there is an emitter, which is engineered. I don't actually understand how it works, but all I do know is that it's engineered in such a way that it gives consistent water out of every hole in the line. So at the end to the beginning, the drips will be consistent. You can see these wet spots in this garden are all about the same size. And so that's really a benefit, because you want to water, in this case, this looks like a situation where it's really, really dry. And so they planted right next to each hole where they planted things, to have that, um, uh, the advantage of the water going specifically to the root zone of the plant that they planted. So, basically how these are designed is you would connect them to your main line. You can get kits for them. You can, in the background here, you can see DripWorks. DripWorks puts together kits for, for garden size kits. Looks like this is for a 20-foot or roughly a 20 by 20 garden. And so how it functions is you need to have a filter to make sure that no debris gets in the line, because if any dirt or debris gets in the line, then those holes get plugged up, and that's a problem. And then there's a pressure regulator, which, your most city water pressure is relatively high, and these need to be, dumbed down a little bit so they don't blow holes in the line. And then it connects to what's called the header, which is this line going across the top, and then perpendicular going down is where those drip tubes are. So this is a perfect setup for a rectangular garden. But if you, and it works out in many situations. It's a very convenient way to water. It's super, super efficient. It's a thing where you would set it up. You could even set it on a timer. You can get those little egg timers that you connect to your water hose and turn it on, and it turns on itself and turns itself off. I mean, there's many layers of automation you can play around with, but it doesn't always cater well to different, garden sizes and or garden layouts. And particularly, if you had a 20 by 20 garden with no paths or like you know, uh, just thoroughfares of where people walk or whatever, then that works out great. But essentially you're just not. If you have raised beds, for instance, there's going to be lines from going from your source, to that, and it's kind of spaghetti hanging all over the garden. Or if there's kids, that play in your garden, they're going to get curious or they're going to mess around with it maybe. And so, it is a really cool and option. But it's just, it takes setup at the beginning of the season, which is, takes a little bit of know-how and some time. And then you need to winterize it and put everything up for the winter. Whereas like these hose options, these different sprayers and hose options are simpler and less things to hold, keep around and store and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Hey, Ebony had a question. First of all, hey, Ebony. And she was wondering how would the drip irrigation work on different design of the garden. She has a mandala garden, but I'm assuming like for a circular garden or different setups.
Yeah, I mean, you can, so in my mind, part of the mandala garden is that it's pretty. And so you got to be strategic, maybe use the staples, but like, if the aesthetics is a thing for you, then, these hoses everywhere is going to be not kind of affect the aesthetic. But you could make it work. It's a little bit more, essentially you just need a main line. This is by far a very simple design, and there's different ways to do it. Like you can get these where there's a little, there's different types of emitters. I mean, there's all kinds of different options, and you can check out the catalogs from companies like Dripworks, and I put a resource page at the end. By the way, all these slides, we're going to share all the slides after the class. I'll email you guys with the slides after the class, and we also will have this video posted on our YouTube channel by next week, hopefully. But it's very soon, if not. So, but yeah, I'm, for the mandala garden, I think you could get creative with it. It's possible. Any other questions before I move on?
Yes. Can you go back to the slide that you had?
The last one?
Yes.
Yes.
So where you ended up having your pressure regulator, I'm collecting water in a 250 tote.
I got something for you. I'm just about to talk about it.
I'm trying to figure out two things. One, how to circulate the water in order to stop the algae from growing. And then the second one is how to maybe increase the pressure just a little bit.
Right.
To get it to the drip.
Good question. We'll be hitting on that.
Okay. I'll hold off then.
Okay. But I definitely will be talking about those things.
Okay.
Here is another. Here is another. Oh man, stop it. I just can't, I'm trying to scroll up and that doesn't work. Here is another irrigation kind of hybrid system of using, you know, the kind of design aesthetic of the drip irrigation with the soaker hoses. I think another layer here is price point. So I think a similar, you know, the soaker hose systems might be, you know, a third cheaper or half, you know, half the price of a drip system for the same size garden. But this is something, you know, that could be played around with. And this is from, oh shoot. I tried to tear out the page so the ad was at the bottom, but you know, I'm not remember what catalog I got this out of. I'm pretty sure it was out of AM Leonard. T, if you could put that in the chat, please. But if this looks really exciting to you, then be sure and hit me up or email me, and I'll make sure I can share it. But moving on, this is going to apply to you, Oliver. This is a kit specifically designed for low flow irrigation. So it's taking the concept of drip irrigation and applying it for when you're working with rain barrels or 250-gallon tanks, because it will function on low pressure. Whereas any of those, the drip irrigation and the soaker hoses, you know, don't work unless the water is pressurized either via a pump or something. This is specifically designed to work on gravity. And so these are a few illustrations of it, how it was set up. You know, they're just using 5-gallon buckets in this situation, but the 275-gallon totes work really great with them as well. And again, we'll have at the end of the presentation, I have links for where you can access these. But it's the same, you know, the same basic concept as the drip irrigation. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how to water. Now let's talk a little bit about just how to keep the water there, or conservation strategies. Far and away, mulching is a really, really useful tool for a number of reasons in the garden, not only for watering, but mulching. When I say mulch, I'm specifically talking more about straw and leaves. Wood chips in the vegetable bed are kind of a pain in the butt because they can cause problems with tying up nitrogen. Since they're so high in carbon, they can tie up nitrogen in the as they break down in the soil, and if they get kind of mixed into the soil a little bit, they're kind of hard to get out. Whereas things like straw and leaves will tend to break down over the course of the season, and they are lighter and you know, much easier to manage in that way. But the concept of mulch, the term mulch, what I mean by is something to cover the soil to help retain moisture. So, you know, when we're watering the garden, again, I mentioned this earlier, like the sun beating down on that dark soil, it just absorbs that heat and it will tend to dry out very quickly. But if you have something to break that up, this straw or shredded leaves, that acts as a, you know, as a stop. You know, it causes the lighter color of the straw will reflect some of that sunlight, and and as the humidity comes off the soil, it traps a little bit, so it keeps it in the zone. And you know, it's clear, like if you know, for instance, if you mulched your garlic last year, but you didn't mulch anywhere else in your garden, if you peel back that straw where your garlic is, and you look at another part of your garden, you know, it'll be night and day. And the other part of that is it really plays a crucial role in helping keep the soil alive. You know, soil is a, living soil is a kind of a living, not a living organism, it's living millions of organisms that basically kind of go into dormancy or dissipate when they dry out. And those organisms play a lot of functions in healthy plant life. And, there's this whole symbiosis between soil health and plant health. So maintaining that moisture in the soil, through the mulch is also a really good, a good thing. So if I would say top of the list in terms of mulches, I would say straw is really one of the best. Leaves are abundant, especially in the fall. And, we have a competition in my neighborhood where who can collect the most leaf bags. I've totally fallen off on that, but my neighbor always gets like, every bag of leaves, drives around and throws them in the back of his car and stockpiles them for the next year to use as mulch and to compost and all that kind of stuff. So it's a free resource. They work better if they're shredded. So if you like went and collected bags, or as you're doing your own leaves at your place, going over them with a lawnmower is a really awesome way to shred them up. Usually what I do is put them all in a pile, and you run the mower where you put it on bag mode, but you take the bag off, or wait, yeah, put it on bag mode, you take the bag off, and where it would normally shoot out into the bag, you point that to the center, so it's shredding it and kicking it back to the center, and you're just going over it again and again and again to get it really nice and fine. And so you spread that over the garden, and that really does a nice job of keeping the moisture in. A few caveats to mulching is, if you're starting new seeds, you may want to basically spread the soil back to give that soil access to the warmth and access to the sunlight once they germinate. So mulching is better served as plants get to like teenager size or slightly bigger. You might even leave like an open ring of 6 to 8 inches around every plant, and just have the remaining soil mulched. You can also, use shredded office paper. I wouldn't do like shredded magazines or anything. It's kind of a mess though, like if it on a windy days, it'll blow around the garden, and it just it's not, I would say it just looks really messy, and it will work, but it's not great. It also will work really well to reflect the sunlight because it's so, so white, but it's also very messy.
Keto, you mulching is a hot topic. So you got like a couple questions in here. So Tamira was asking, where's a good place to find straw? I saw a couple people mention some spots. I've gone to animal stores. How about you? Old Halloween places?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, so one, to clarify, when you're going to stores, especially if you're going to the animal stores, you want straw, not hay. Hay is for horses. Hay's got seeds in it. Hay is a feed source, whereas straw is just the stem of the plant. In theory, even though the straw I bought last year has got a bunch of grass going in my garlic right now, but in terms of, so it's certain times of the year it's harder to find than others. I mean, it's like one of those things that you can find readily during the like fall, because it's, people use it for decorations or for for Halloween and all that kind of stuff. I don't know, I mean, pet stores is a good option. Maybe think places like Tractor Supply.
I even saw like there was some at Meyer last year, like in the garden section. It's like bagged instead of
Right.
That's
And
what I use.
yeah. I mean, ideally, you're not paying much more than $5 for a bale.
Yeah,
And you can actually get it compressed. You know, when it's in plastic, it's compressed, so you're
right.
getting more.
It was quite a bit.
Yeah.
Then a couple questions here, so we'll get through them here. That was one of them. Linnell said, what was the difference between straw and hay? I think we got that one. And then Marie had this idea here, putting cardboard over the wood chips and then compost and then topsoil, kind of layering for a vegetable garden. I don't know if you saw that in there.
No, I don't have the chat up, so I'm replying.
Okay, okay,
Uh, that sounds like lasagna gardening, so that's a great way to start a new garden, but it's kind of something where usually you would do that layering and then let it decompose for a while and then get to planting, because it's like all those layers need to do their thing, and usually it's a situation where you're doing that over grass to save yourself the labor of digging up the grass. So if you're trying to start a new garden and you got time but you don't want to put a whole lot of effort into it, doing that lasagna style thing like you were kind of describing is a really good option.
yeah,
Cardboard, cardboard, you can, in theory, if it's a thinner cardboard, and you can kind of shape it to the garden, or like it's not too dense or thick or hard to work with, you could cut holes in it and plant in those. I've also seen people use coffee bags, but you just have to be. It's a tricky thing, and I don't have enough personal experience with it. I do know that if it gets too dry, then it'll have a wicking action and actually pull the water out of the soil, so it doesn't function as much in that mulch way, so to speak. But it's worth experimenting with for sure.
yeah. The other question here from Tish was asking, should you place the leaves down before or after planting the seeds? I think you mentioned that. Maybe she
Yeah.
asked before, but
Yeah, definitely, especially with small things like if you're doing lettuce mix, or I mean, it really depends on the planting. If you're doing something that's essentially going to become a carpet, like a baby leaf salad mix or arugula or something, then you want to leave that soil bare, and you wouldn't really end up mulching it. But with a tomato plant or a collard plant or something like that, then you would, to start, I would maybe leave open, um, a ring of 6 or 8 inches, and then seeds, like say you started some squash seeds, I maybe do the same thing, and that's actually going to help you remember where you planted things too, and ultimately as it pops out. So, and as it gets a little bit bigger, then you can make this ring, push the mulch a little bit closer to the base of the plant too.
yeah. So Francis, hey Francis, I haven't seen your face, and I'm about to scroll these squares to find Francis' face. She said, what if you place garden fabric under the mulch, which is typically what I would do, especially landscaping flowers. What do you think about garden fabric under your mulch?
Yeah, sure. Landscape
Yeah.
fabric.
Yeah.
Yeah, landscape fabric, then mulch in the vegetable bed.
Yeah. I mean, I do
Probably
landscape
overkill.
fabric and wood chips for not vegetable, but for flowers. So
Oh, yes. Um,
what are your thoughts on landscape fabric with vegetables?
well, I'm gonna hold that thought for 1 second. I want to come, like, for flowers. Yeah, I mean, um, for flowers, it's like, I guess the main function there would be to keep weeds down, in my mind. Um, and that's fine, and that works, and that's kind of a standard practice. I think one thing about landscape fabric is, unless your beds are totally flat, then it's kind of relatively smooth, and so the mulch will tend to slide off of it, and you'll have this like exposed landscape fabric, which is kind of ugly. And so if you're just doing mulch, then even though it'll decay over time, it tends to look nicer in my mind, but it's totally a personal preference kind of thing. But let's talk about this landscape fabric, because I believe, yeah, because this is not a pixelated image, but I think you guys will get the idea. This has become a more common tool, especially on larger scale farms, to help keep moisture in, to help keep weed pressure down, and kind of make crops easily managed. We're doing this with strawberries at the KGD farm, and we're experimenting with doing tomatoes and a few other things. And so basically what it is it's the woven landscape fabric that's got like the kind of woven mesh. DeWitt, DEWITT is one company that makes it. You can find it at a lot of big box stores. It's not, it's relatively easy to find. And basically what you do is you can take a torch, like a propane torch, and burn holes in it at the specific distances that you want to use for that specific crop, and then put it down and staple it with the landscape staples, and then plant into it. And well, actually, I'm sorry, to add to that, you probably put drip irrigation down first, and then the fabric, and then plant into that, and then you kind of have a whole system set up that works really nicely. Especially if you have a very large garden, it's really great for keeping weeds in check, and it also is really good at conserving moisture, and it lasts 5 to 7 years before it starts to need to be replaced. Okay, so now I'm gonna say we're moving on. We're gonna transition. Does any questions before we move on to kind of change topics here?
Any burning questions? I think I got through all of them on the chat. So
okay,
I have
great.
a question.
Yeah.
yes.
I have leaves being brought to my farm, and they are like sitting and he's chopping them up, so shredding them before he leaves, and so they are kind of like decomposing at the same time. What do you think about using those leaves as mulch? Like,
yeah, no, it's just fine. It's not gonna, I mean, even if they're decomposing like that, there's no risk there, I would say.
okay, I could still just use them to like spread as mulch like you're suggesting.
Yep. Yes, for sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's all my only question. But anybody need leaves? I think I got somebody who can bring y'all leaves, or y'all can come and get them from here, because he's bringing a lot of leaves and I don't know what to do with them.
Okay. Well, if maybe there's a better way to connect with you via the social medias, or however, maybe put it in the chat.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So now I'm going to get into thinking a little bit more specifically, and this is leading into the conversation about rainwater catchment. But this is like kind of some information to share about how to get to understand like how much is what Mother Nature providing, and how much in terms of volume, how many gallons of water do I need for if I'm designing a rainwater catchment system, or I'm thinking through a project where I need to know how much I'm watering, or even if I'm trying to think about what my water bill is going to be. First, and you can do this along in real time if you want. We're going to use an example of a 20-foot by 20-foot garden. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate the square footage of the garden. So in this case, we have a 400 square foot garden that we're using as our example. And based on what we were talking about earlier, you know, we know this general recommendation that we have 1 inch of water per week. And so, and then we're going to take that and use the gallon conversion factor, which is 0.623. So we multiply the square footage of our garden times 0.623 times the 4 weeks. And that's going to tell us how many gallons of water that, you know, 20 by 20 garden needs per month, which is almost 1,000 gallons. Believe it or not, that's crazy, huh? But we got Mother Nature, and Mother Nature does this pretty decent. We get, you know, if we say that our growing season is somewhere between April and October, you know, we're getting 2 to 3 inches per month. This is, I didn't update this slide for this year, but this was from last year. So it's still pretty current. You know, so that in this situation, we can say that Mother Nature on average compensates for about 50, you know, roughly 40 to 65, or we're just going to use for our estimation, 50% of our rainwater needs. So all that said, you know, really, you know, our garden needs after the rainfall about 500 gallons of, you know, for a 20 by 20 garden. And so, it's useful knowledge to know. So, you know, remember that, or you have those slides on hand. Remember that conversion factor. That's the thing, the one number that isn't, you know, kind of common sense. 0.623. And then, so that helps us figure out when we're starting to think about setting up a rainwater catchment system. So let's talk about rainwater catchment systems. They are definitely a boon, and can be very useful for many situations, particularly if you are in a situation where you do not have access to city water. You know, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but it also serves a greater good by diverting the rainwater from our overtaxed sewage system. We have some problems with our sewage system here in the city, if you're not familiar. And they're relatively easy to set up. The cons of rainwater catchment systems is you are essentially, you know, need to work with them having low or no pressure. So basically what that means is you don't have the assistance of a water pump, or unless you have the assistance of an electrified pump, you do not have water pressure. And so you're either watering with a water can or a low flow drip irrigation system, like I was talking about earlier. But you don't have like the ability to do the hose, you know, like I was, you know, like, or the different hose options like I was showing earlier. And they do require, you know, some seasonal maintenance. And I think I got to make sure to come back to Oliver's question about the algae, because it's definitely something to be addressed.
Also, Tish had a question about adding nutrients to the water in the system.
Who's that? Who did?
Tish, she said, could you add anything like a natural fertilizer to the water to feed the plants? So if you can add that into your.
Yes. So we put together a reference guide for use and safety tips. This is available on our website. and I'm gonna just highlight a few of the things, but you can read through. Oh, I thought, huh,
To grab that link for folks, huh? That's on the
Yeah.
website.
yes, please. Okay, well, I thought I shared, huh, okay. Well, in any case, I'll talk about some of the highlights of it. So, rainwater catchment systems, the water is is a really great option, but we are, if you're setting up a system like that, we really encourage people to try and use the water um, within 2 weeks of harvest. So it can be a little bit of a frustrating situation because your tanks are going to fill up when you get a good rain. And so you probably have a week after that where you probably don't need it too much. And then you have a week to use it up. Um, and that's because the reason why we recommend this, and this relates to what Oliver was asking about, is that if that water, if it sits for too long, we'll start to have algae growth. And there's a couple things to do about that. One, you can slow algae growth by painting your tanks. And usually be sure and use, depending on what you're using as tanks. How are we doing on time? Okay. But usually, try and get some kind of, I would recommend a spray paint and something that specifically bonds well. Look at the spray paint and make sure that it bonds to plastic, because I definitely have used spray paints that did not work well and chipped off, and it was a big mess. You can also, if that's not an option to use up that water in that time frame, you can also do a very small addition of bleach to the water to sanitize it. So there's recommendation, I believe it was like a tablespoon for every 55 gallons or something like that. It is on this reference guide that's on our website. I don't remember off the top of my head. And then the third thing that I want to just highlight off of this is that, well, two more things. Third thing is that this is absolutely, any kind of time you're using catchment water, it is not potable. It is not intended for washing your hands, washing your produce, drinking. Not a good thing. Could be bacterial loads. If there was bird poop on the roof that you are capturing water off of, it's a problem. All right. So
question about, or maybe if you're going to get to this, but about the asphalt. If you're collecting off of asphalt, does it harm the plants?
Asphalt roof.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just like, I was thinking like the road, like, no, yes, asphalt roof, yes. It's hard to say for sure. I would say I would maybe be a little suspect if it was an asphalt roof. There is, like water moves in a rain event, water can move really quickly. And so there's an option to set up what's called a first flush system. Maybe you could write that in the chat, because I didn't put it in the slides, but that's something maybe I should add down the road. But a first flush is basically where it's designed to offset. It's something that takes out the first rinse of the water. So basically, the first rain that comes off of the roof goes into the first flush, and then the remaining water goes into the tank. And so you get that rinse. In that circumstance, that would maybe be a better, that would be something to consider for the asphalt roof. So let's just I want to talk about a little bit more about Detroit's combined sewer system. So unfortunately, and this was, borrowed from our partners with the Land and Water Works. We're part of a group of a number of nonprofit organizations in Detroit that are trying to help support education and resources and infrastructure and knowledge to citizens to know how to help improve the systems, so we're not having problems with poor water quality. But basically, we in Detroit have a combined sewer system, which means that the roof water, the sewage water, storm water, all goes into, in an ideal situation, into the treatment plant. But if we have really, really big rain events, which have become more prominent and more, so like one effect of climate change is that we have bigger rain events less frequently, whereas, historically we've had smaller rain events more frequently, which is more ideal for us gardeners. But as the rain events tend to be more intense and less frequent, as as one effect of climate change. So a number of things contributing to um, getting into the rainwater, and if we have these big rain events, that all of these things combine together, and the system here is overwhelmed, and we end up with this contaminated water going to the tree, the system is overwhelmed in such a way that it doesn't go straight to the treatment system or the treatment plant. It ends up into our waterways, which causes all kinds of implications for the wildlife that live in the water and our water quality, and it's a big deal. So doing rainwater catchment system is one way to help deal with the problem. And we've been also doing a little bit of research, Keep Growing Detroit, with the help of some engineers, did some research on rainwater catchment, and if we have a whole report on our website, the link is below on the slide here, and T could even put the link in the chat. And we wanted to know, how can urban agriculture be an integral part of stormwater management in the city? How can we quantify rainwater harvesting as a stormwater management technique? And how can we quantify, a local water balance and evaluate the amount of rainwater being captured and treated by urban agriculture? And so what we did was, we worked with, partnered with a number of gardens across the city, and did a bunch of tests and used these special little things that look like a bullet. That's a diver that is a little computer that tells when the water goes up and down and how much water was being used and so on and so forth. And there's a lot more information than this, but I just, to summarize a few of the highlights. So rainwater, some of the findings are rainwater harvesting is a very viable management strategy. But as I mentioned earlier, it's really crucial for this to not become contributing to the problem with overflow, is that the water needs to be used up between these big rain events.
Hey, Keto, I think Siobhan had a clarifying question here.
Yeah.
She's saying, do you mean a pipe going straight in the ground? And I think I must have missed what you were talking about. So maybe you know what she's saying. Also, Siobhan, if you want to come off mute to ask that question better, because I'm not clear. Were you saying something about a pipe going straight in the ground?
I was asking about the water system. Say if you hook like a small pipe going directly into your garden beds, almost, would that be okay? Or would you still have to find a way to
Are
add
you talking
boosters?
about like you're like running your gutter right into your garden beds?
Yeah, almost like that.
I would not recommend that because I think you're kind of, if I'm getting what you're saying, like I think you're kind of thinking of like those systems where you have, there's like a little inlet and you just pour the water in the inlet and the water, and that waters your whole garden kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's like strategies for doing that for like containers and stuff for like but for in-ground gardens, I don't think that really is going to work for you because it doesn't really have a way to, without digging in the ground and using pipes in the ground to spread the water over space for it to saturate into a certain amount of area. And then running running your downspout right into your garden is not going to be helpful because rainwater is inconsistent, and when it comes, it tends to come out of the spigot in volumes. Like I have a perfect example in my own garden right now is that the gutter fell off of my garage, and now the water is just, I have a huge puddle right at the base, right in the corner of my garage, because the water is just concentrating right there. And I actually, when I got the gutters put on my garage, we talked about that and we ran the gutter over there, and I took it off because it was flooding out my garden every time we had a decent rain event. So you want to have it where you can control the amount of water you're putting down, and just letting Mother Nature, do that at will through the concentration of water from your roof it's not gonna be helpful.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to summarize a little bit more of the research that we did, is that, garden beds are really, really efficient at storing water and holding on to water. And this particularly applies to, we're trying to lobby with the city to not, or to some way not have drainage fees, or to be able to adjust drainage fees for use of water, because every gallon of water we use, we pay not only for the water itself, but for the drainage of that water. And if we're using up that water in our gardens, there's no drainage happening. We're just being charged for that regardless. So this is this is a way to tell the city, the water department, hey, you get a break here somehow. And that's still like, still something, it's a conversation. It's hard to measure and it's hard to calculate and it's hard to quantify for the city. So it's a difficult, thing, but we're moving forward, and this research is really helpful. And this is just echoing that. And part of that, part of the why it's holding on to so much water is because of high organic matter, all the compost that we're putting in our soils. Compost is really amazing at holding on to water, many times more than in a standard, just topsoil lot. And, in terms of urban agriculture soils, could be at least 3 times more effective than what the water and sewage department is assuming as typical topsoils. So, good information to build on as we move forward. So that's food for thought. Okay. So when we're putting together a rainwater catchment system, we need to figure out how much, well, there's basically, we've gotten a sense, we did the calculation earlier to figure out how much water does my garden need. And then you can use similar calculations to measure the roof that you're working with, to figure out how much water am I going to collect from that. So you can figure out how big of a tank you need, how many 275 gallon tanks do you need to buy 1,000 gallon tank, things of that sort. It's a similar calculations. It's basically getting the square footage, and you got to think about, in terms of a roof, you got to look at, you might need to figure out how to redirect the gutters, because usually gutters are set up on a house or on a garage or a building where they're on varying corners of the garage to evacuate the water away from the structure. I mean, the function of gutters is to move water away from the building to not cause problems with the foundation. And so basically, you in your figuring, you have to be like, okay, I'll be able to, these two gutters go, or these two gutters go to this downspout, and that's where I'm going to be capturing watering from. And so if of the 4 panels of a roof, so to speak, of a standard roof, 2 of those probably go to one gutter and 2 go to another. Can you redirect them both to go to the tanks setup, or is it just half? And if it's just half, then you're calculating the square footage for that half to figure out how much water you're going to be able to collect. You guys with me? Okay. So, and then you're again, multiplying that square footage by the conversion factor for gallons, this 0.623, and that's going to tell you in an inch of rain how much water you can collect. So on a 15-foot by 15-foot shed, which is 225 square feet, I can collect about 280 gallons. And so on the left-hand side here in this image is something we were working with Slanchel and her husband there on a system off of their house. And that was a situation where we directed all the gutters to the one side of the house. And we set up the system, based on the size of their garden. So, that if there's any one takeaway from this part of the presentation, I would recommend that you think about, before you go out and start buying tanks or doing this or that, figure out how much, water are you going to get off of that roof and how much water do you need for that garden, which essentially is about the same square footage. Like if you think about it, if your garden is 20 by 20, then, you probably, well, actually it's half of that. So if your garden's 20 by 20 and we do the conversion factors and Mother Nature is compensating for about half of that rainwater, then you need about the other half, or about a roof about half the size of your garden to capture enough rainwater. And so you can figure out how many gallons that's going to be. And then that's how you figure out the size of your tanks.
Mm-hmm. So you said something striking to me, like those 55-gallon tanks are not collecting enough water for most gardens. Is that what you would say?
Right. And I haven't even mentioned that yet, but thanks for bringing that up. So, most common, the most well-known rainwater collection is the rain barrel. And it, you've seen the numbers I've been running so far. A rain barrel is going to fill up in a second off of, it fills up very, very quickly off of a standard roof. And so, and most gardens are going to need more water than 55 gallons. If you have a few raised beds, then it works out well. And rain barrels, can have a place. We like to use, one really useful use of those type of barrels is what we call a field barrel, which is basically a situation where if you have a garden, you don't have access to a roof, and you don't have access to running water right in your garden, maybe it's down the street or whatever, but you can access your neighbor's hose once a week or once every couple of weeks, then you can borrow their hose, water your garden once, and fill the barrel. And that's, can be your reserve to water the garden, more times down the road. So they're helpful for that. But and you can also, similar to what we did in the slide here on the left, you can gang them together, a bunch of them, to get to the volume of water that you need. But in that case, it seems like for the effort that you're putting into it, the 275-gallon tanks aren't that much more expensive, and you're getting 3 or more times, the amount of water.
Mm-hmm. I asked that because Gwen was asking, is there some, like a pump system for the smaller rain barrels, the 55-gallon that you know about? And also, is there a solar pump system that you know about?
I know that there are options for putting together solar, but I'm not super well versed in it yet. Like and solar seems to be, solar is getting better and better as the years go on, and it's getting cheaper. And it seems to be like, I think there's, I see a lot of trends with solar, so I'm excited about that. But we did help, we were part of a project with a garden over near U of D Mercy, MoFlo garden. Is it MoFlo or Flow? MoFlo, right? They have a solar panel that powers a pump for them. So it is possible. There's a lot of technicality with it, like converting DC to AC to power the pump, and we're not going to dive too deep on that, but the short of it is there are possibilities with that. I would, you could also potentially, because those big lithium ion batteries are becoming more prevalent, and different types of batteries. It also could be a situation where you have some kind of, high capacity, lithium battery that could power a pump too. It'd be something you have to schlep back and forth each time you use it. If it's not at your home site, but it's, that there's possibilities there. The pumps, and there's an image of, I'll be sharing an image of the pump, one of the pumps that we like and have been using, but usually, generally, I'm finding that there's like a couple different types of pumps. There's the submersible pumps, like you would have, in some basements, like if you're in case of high water table, you have a pump to evacuate the water. And then there's what's called a transfer pump, which is kind of like a vacuum style pump. But those kind of because the water would be coming, it would be sucking on the water, and I think it can bear down on the, you're not getting the volume that you want, and that can, burn out the pump is the short of it. So coming back to these slides, they're, essentially, if you are thinking about trying to put together some rainwater catchment system, the first thing I would say is, and this is always when I'm doing consultations with people, is the first thing I say is there a roof nearby that you can capture rainwater off of? Because that's always the best first option. It's always the most inexpensive first option, and you're always going to get the most volume off of a big roof. Because this is, this right here is a design we put together, and the plans for this are on our website. It's on the link at the bottom of the page here, and maybe T could put that in the chat as well. And essentially, we designed this to be a freestanding structure to capture rainwater. They work really well. They function nicely as a shade structure in a garden, so they have a lot of functions to them. But the reality of them is that they have a limited, they only have a limited footprint. It's only 8 by 12. So in an average rain, I think it's in a 1 inch of rain, they can capture, I think it's like 70 gallons of water or something, which is it's nothing to shake a stick at. It's, it's helpful. But comparing that to, a roof of a house, you can get a lot more water off of this roof than you would off of that little roof. So that's kind of our first general recommendation. You'll see that in both of these systems here on these slides, and on the right hand here, we're assembling a stand for the tanks, that we recommend doing a stand for the tanks to sit on, so you can access the water because if it's sitting on the ground, you can't get even a watering cannon or a bucket or anything under there to get the water out. So, and you need to, on some level, you need to have above the ground for the gravity. And the plans for these stands are the stands here are also in that manual, and it's really I highly recommend you when you're building something for these tanks to be on that it's beefy, it can take the weight, because it's a 275 gallon tank is somewhere near a 1,000 gallon or 1,000 pounds of water.
Yeah, Patrice was asking, do you tilt those? And that goes to the question of
Right. It's a lean-to. Yes, exactly. So it's sloped to one side, and then the water runs into the gutter and into the tank. Yep.
Yeah, and then Halima was asking, and this is you can tell our crew drawing there is that wrapped in fabric, if you want to explain the green on there.
Oh yeah. Well, so this was an after, we took these pictures when we were putting these together, and it was before we started painting the tanks. And we recommend painting the tanks to limit algae growth, and we wanted to have a good visual demonstration of what it should look like. So that's not. It could be wrapped in anything. It could be like plywood panels attached to the outside with artwork or whatever. You just want to limit the light getting in, because that's a factor for causing the algae growth.
Does that answer Oliver's question there earlier around the algae? Is that the main?
Yeah, I think and Oliver, speak up if you want, but I think he was asking about how to circulate the water, because that would be potentially another way to limit algae growth. But in my mind, it's like, well, then you need some power. So I would lean towards more treating the water with a little bit of bleach.
So presently so if you think about those big signs that are above stores, I get those tarps pretty much for free. And that's what I've ended up turning it inside out, so the white is facing out, and I wrap it like a present. Beautiful. So the course of circulating, I've had low algae growth, but I'm trying to experiment with other ways to circulate the water, because mosquitoes don't like being in water that's flowing or turbulent. In addition to that, I've been dropping in a small bottle of hydrogen peroxide.
Yes. So I definitely think those are good options. I definitely would not use any of those mosquito donuts or those things, because I think those would be maybe toxic to plants. I'm not familiar with what rates you would use hydrogen peroxide, but I think it's a viable option. I would just research how much per water, how much per gallon or whatever. And same with bleach. Definitely be careful with that. You brought up another thought. We also like to use, and I didn't mention this earlier, I'm glad we're thinking of this now. We recommend that you put some kind of screen on the inlet where the water comes into the tanks, to keep debris, like leaves and such, out of the water, and that will help keep the water sanitary to some degree. It help if there's leaves and things falling in them, that they'll get funky over time. And it also will help to some degree with the mosquitoes.
I'm sorry, Oliver. Keep going, because there was also a question about just general maintenance from Halima. So maybe you can kind of tie all of that in.
Yeah.
But
the screen I do to keep the organic material out, because that will feed the algae as it breaks down. But the hydrogen peroxide for 4 ounces bombs a 275 tote.
Okay.
So the reason for doing that is getting rid of the salmonella that may accompany bird feces.
Yeah.
Top of the roof.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. And just to reiterate, like, this is not potable water. Do not wash your hands. Do not wash your produce with this water. It's just intended for water, and really you want to just water the roots of the plants with this water, because of the potential. Even if you're treating the water, we just don't we don't want to have that risk of potential salmonella or things of that sort.
So what I'm hoping is that the drip hoses, because I don't have it above the plants, like onto lettuce and stuff, that as the water gets directly onto the ground, the soil ecology is what ultimately destroys bacterial components if the soil is healthy.
Yeah. Right on. On point, man. Okay. Okay. Just general maintenance.
Yeah. A couple other questions piling up too. So.
Okay. So, you know, so let's from the top. Trying to use the water every, after a rain event, trying to use it within 2 weeks. And if you can't, trying to either, do something to sanitize it. Having a screen on the top to filter out debris. And then, so that's just during the regular growing season. And then as the growing season comes to an end, you're going to take, you want to drain the tank. You don't have to drain it 100% out, at least 3/4 drain out the water. A full tank, if we have a deep freeze winter, can crack the tank or crack the outlets. Honestly, I actually would drain it almost completely and leave the valve open, now that I think about it, because that will help prevent, because I have been in we've had a few growers that we were working with that the valve on the bottom, the outlet valve cracked, and it basically ruins the tank. And then you want to take the downspout with that, the corrugated downspout, and take it off and point it away from the tank. So it's, as during the winter months, it's draining away. Paying attention to algae. I mean, there's not a whole lot more than that. I mean, if the tanks are empty, you might want to figure out a way to secure them. We have, we have screwed them to the stand just in case, just for preventing, theft or vandalism. But it's not that much, it's not terrible.
And then, so I think that answered Linnell's question, how long can water sit before it's no good? And you just said 2 weeks. So I think the question here, Linnell, you come off mute if you think I'm not asking the question right here, but it says, are there like accidental containers that you use? Are there any other, like, if you didn't have this big system, what I'm getting from this question is, do you have like any suggestions for just like, could you use a bucket? Could you use, any other water catchment type of situations? And if that's not the question, Linnell, please come off and mute and ask your question. Any thoughts on that? And there's a few questions here piling up, so we'll go through them fast.
Well, I'll just talk to containers in general. If you're looking for 275-gallon totes or any of these barrels, be sure and get food grade. Make sure that they did not store diesel fuel or detergents or any kind of nasty chemicals. And usually they will say, most vendors will say food grade. And in terms of sourcing them, there's not a great, there used to be some good, we had 2 different places that were great sources for a while, and both of them are no longer available. But most of the time I've, and people, please speak up in the chat if you know of a good source. But I think mostly people have been finding them on places like Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist. And, every time I go on, I seem to find them. So it seems like they're semi-regular supply. In terms of using different vessels, like, I mean, if it's a small, it's, you know, I guess if we're talking about buckets or things like, yeah, you can capture rainwater that way, but you're just like, they're gonna fill up so quick, and I'm not sure if it's really worth the effort. And so I'm just gonna leave that question there, because if there's more to it, please follow up.
Yeah. And then Sarah had a creative idea. Can we use goldfish in the tank to eat mosquitoes?
Yes, but then you gotta take care of the goldfish. So, you know, and you can't see in there, but maybe if you have kids and they're really excited about it, yeah. I mean, play around with it. I think it's, you know, maybe you could figure out a way to not spray the whole thing, or I don't know, or put a window in there somehow. I don't know. It's a fun idea for sure. But how are you gonna get them out? Because like you don't have a whole, like, it's not like the top is open. You just have like a this big an opening at the top. So you gotta, yes, maybe they'll eat the mosquitoes when it's mosquito season, but you also got to keep them fed, you know, like I'm sure they're going to need to be fed otherwise. So, but I mean, it's fun. I would, you know, if you're excited about it, play around with it. I don't think it's a terrible idea.
All right. And then from Sharon, it says, I have 2 plastic Farmer pickle barrels, as water barrels. They don't seem to be letting light in. Do I need to paint them? So I think
If
that,
they're like those orange ones, or red or orange or whatever, I think that, yeah, I don't think you need to paint those.
and then for painting barrels, do you recommend reflective color? It says, like silver, or try to, or something that rejects heat, or what particular color and paint have you found works best?
I just kind of settled on green, not for any particular reason. I think that I would guess I would lean towards darker colors because they're going to limit light more. Like some paints are better at coverage too than others. I definitely learned that Lowe's brand spray paint that we got last time was kind of crap. And the one that we had prior was much better at adhesion. But I was always just looking for ones that were, you know, specifically designed to adhere to plastic. Okay, ready to move on?
There was a couple here. Is there a salmonella concern using this water to water leaves of things like lettuce, kale, etc.?
It's, you know, if the water gets on the leaf, like if you're using, you know, a watering can and you're watering from the top of the plant, and it's like a collard plant or whatever, something that is the edible leaves, it's okay. Just wash the plant really well with city water before you eat it. Okay, so why don't we hold the questions for a second and let's try and get through the rest of these slides, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. So just not, this doesn't apply to everybody. I just want to highlight this for a second here, that you can do gutter systems on high tunnels or hoop houses. We have a setup here for the tunnels that we have at the Keep Growing Detroit farm. And I'll just say, if that's something, I'm not going to get too deep into it, other than, you know, if that's something that's piques your interest and you have a high tunnel or you're planning on a high tunnel, please reach out. I definitely have recommendations. There are some illustrations here just to highlight. We also have a stencil for non-potable water. So if you have tanks and you want to create signage for non-potable water, we can do it pretty quickly with, it's a stencil. You can just spray paint it on there, and you're welcome to, we can figure out how to help you, you know, do that. And you can see the screen there on the tank. All right, so, okay. So I wanted to take a second here, and if T would please put this link in the chat. So I just wanted to take a sidestep for a second and just mention that we are trying to help gardens as much as possible. If you're a community school or market garden that has a special project, including you're interested in doing some kind of rainwater collection system, we have some resources that we're working with to be able to support gardens, and basically it's an application system. And this is, this garden development application is really designed to see how we can help you in a lot of ways, but it does drill down to if you are looking into building some kind of system, this would be a way that we might be able to help you out. We are doing, I think, T, help me remember here, are we doing 2 or 3 application rounds this year? Okay, I believe we're doing 2. But in any case, T's going to put the link in the chat and you can fill out that application. We'll follow up with you and see how we might be able to help you out. If that's
Sorry, actually doing 3. Yep.
We're doing 3. Okay, thank you. All right, so yeah, so I just wanted to point that out, that we are trying to find more ways that we can help people. If you were familiar, we were helping. We did a program in past years, which was called WaterWise, where we were helping people do those. That's where some of those pictures came from, rainwater collection systems. So we've kind of modified that to be more broad and general based on people's interest for projects that they're trying to get happening at their gardens. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a rainwater collection system, but since we're talking about it today, we wanted to make sure that you knew about this effort. And yes, I have lots of tabs open on my screen all the time. That's from a screenshot from my computer. Oh, these are, yeah, this is, well, this, my slide, when I did the editing, this is just highlighting that resource guide that I was talking about earlier. These slides ended up, these slides ended up at the end of the presentation, but the link for this is in the chat. I'm not going to spend much more time with this. And you can take a look at it when we share the slides later. I just want to highlight some other efforts for stormwater management, and is one in particular is rain gardens. And one of our partner organizations, Friends of the Rouge, do every year. I think they're doing an online version of it this year called Rain Gardens to the Rescue. So you can check out therouge.org and look for Rain Gardens to the Rescue. Rain gardens essentially are gardens that are designed specifically to manage heavy rainfalls. It's particularly, if you are a lot of institutions like churches and places that have large parking lots have been hit with really high drainage costs with the reorganizing of how the water and sewage department manages drainage fees. And so basically this is one way that you can get a tax credit, or not a tax credit, a credit to be able to mitigate the fees, to show that you are diverting your drainage into a garden that can basically manage that water, can take up that water and grow and keep it out of the rainwater system, the combined sewer system. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here. Here's a page on resources. I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for the toads, tanks, and barrels, to check out Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. Again, be sure it's a food grade barrel. And then also, wouldn't be a bad idea to reach out to local distilleries or beer brewers. Sometimes they get those 275 gallon tanks, and they're available. And then if you're thinking about getting really large tanks, I would recommend National Tank Outlet. That's where we got those 1,100 gallon tanks that we have at the Keep Growing Detroit farm. I've done some price shopping and they seem to be, pretty good for what they provide. And they're really good about, you can actually do some price shopping on their website. I would recommend calling them because they you know, in the research that I did for some of the purchases that I've done is like, I thought I was going to pay so much and they were able to give me a better price because they were able to find it closer because they have storage facilities around the country. So they try and hook you up with a local vendor or closer to you anyways. And then towards the bottom here are some other resources for drip irrigation and low flow irrigation and sump pumps. And with that, this is my email address. Feel free if you know, as you are, you know, navigating your water needs and you have questions, I'm happy to answer emails. And at this point, we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, we're at the Q&A section. If you want to come off of mute, I think that's okay. How about you? How do you feel about that, Keto? I think
Yeah, please.
come off of mute, and if you have questions about, there was a lot of content. You went all the way down to how to water and all the way up to the rain catchment system. So a lot of content. So if you have any questions about anything specific, anything I didn't get to the chat, in the chat, I tried to get to everything. But if I missed something, feel free to come off of mute. And
I do have a question about the Groya link that I put in the chat. It's probably way back there, but it's basically what you call it, a bulb that's, it looks like it's made out of clay, fired pottery kind of thing, and you pour water in it. And I'm thinking if you just have like a, I don't know, an aluminum trough and 2 of those things in there, and you're just growing flowers or whatever. I know there's like 3 weeks out of the year when it's like super, super dry and it's really, really hot. And I don't know if anybody has ever had an experience using those things.
I don't. I think the concept is like that the water in the clay pot will like slowly transfer into the soil.
Yeah.
You know, on a small scale, in you know, in a smaller growing situation, like a 4x4 raised bed or something. You know, maybe that would work. I'm not sure. I don't have enough practical experience to say.
Okay.
That product sounded cool to me. I would try it out first just by using a terracotta pot, because that would be really cheap and you could just find like a stone to plug the bottom. And you can try it out and see if it works without buying an expensive product.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Keto, what about using water from your dehumidifier? You know, I just feel bad that you're constantly going through the
Yeah, you know what?
drains. Can you capture that?
Yeah.
I mean, I
don't think
can't
there's any-
capture it, but is it okay with flowers and plants?
Yeah, I don't see any problem with that.
Okay.
I thought about the same thing. I actually thought about using it in the washing machine, and my wife was like, "No."
I've used it on my plants. It was no problem.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. This is Ebony speaking.
Okay.
All right. So, what would be best in a shared area with trees and perennials as well as annual plants? I guess I'm thinking about like the mulching. I'm thinking about mulching because I know earlier you said that there's pros and cons to using wood chips, and you recommended straw. So, in an area like that, where it's a shared space between, like I said before, trees, perennials, and annual plants, what would you recommend?
Perennials and trees our wood chips are A1, great, perfect. It's just that wood chips are not ideal for, because they tie, because they're just a little bit finicky and they can tie up nitrogen in the soil because they're high in carbon. So I think, I mean, that's more or less what I would say is wood chips on perennial things.
Say the last line again, you said wood chips are what?
Wood chips for perennial things.
Oh, wood chips for perennial things. Got you. Okay.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
I'm gonna, because I didn't do, there was a question here about the first flush I thought from Jerome. So hopefully this will help. So basically, if you imagine that, this isn't perfect, I just did a Google search really quick. So in the top right hand corner, the water is coming out of your from the source, and it has to go into some kind of vessel. And I've seen them set up in different ways. I think you can set them up with 5-gallon buckets or whatever. But basically, it goes to, if you're going, if ultimately it's going into a tank, it's got to go past, this down pipe first, which fills up with all the initial amount of water, and then and that's the first flush, and then that ball kind of caps off the contaminated water, and then it goes on to the tank. It's not, this isn't a great illustration. I think I've seen better examples, but I think, and then you have to calculate, I think you need to calculate how big the first flush is based on the size of the roof. So it is a little more, require a little bit more planning, but that's the the general concept. Okay. Anybody else? All right.
Right at 8 o'clock. Perfect.
Answered all the questions. You guys are pros now.
Thank you. Thank you, T.
Okay. We're gonna wrap things up, and you should check in your email. I'll share the slides in the next week or so from today's presentation, and be sure and check out our YouTube channel with all of the classes that we've been hosting on Zoom, and we'll see you at the next one.
Peace.
Peace. Bye, guys.